which I consider a maneuvering chess symphony, where Rubinstein is maneuvering his pieces, improving them in the most textbook way, such an instructive way, and he also wins the game from it. So let's see. I'm going to frame it as a series of exercises, but let's just first see. So he's playing against Janowski, and this game is really famous. You guys might have seen it. And we start with the 4 knights. And 4 knights is not really popular anymore, so I'll just briefly give something about why. This game happened in what year? 1907. That was a good year for Rubinstein. Now, after Bishop b5, Bishop b4 was popular back then, but sometime in like the 2000s, I think Kramnik pushed this knight d4 thing. 66, you are correct. It is popular in scholastics, but they also know zero theory. So at the top level, it's kind of fallen out, but beginners continue to move their knights before bishops and castle. But with knight d4, Kramnik basically like shut down the 2 knights for white. They just don't like to do it anymore. So the details of this are very complicated. I don't want to get into the full details because that's a story for another day. But I just wanted to send you guys on the right track if you want to know why people don't play 4 knights as white. So Bishop b4 was popular back in this day. And a common way to play this opening at that time was to give doubled pawns. This was before the Soviet players revolutionized the understanding of dynamic chess. Which doesn't mean that this is inaccurate. This is still a fine move. It's just that the style at that time was to try to play against these weaknesses because Steinitz's influence was very recent. People were not really sacking pawns, ruining the structure for the attack the way that they did, like starting maybe 50 years after this. So going through the opening, this move Queen e7 was probably beginning to arrive around this time. And it's a weird looking move because your queen stays in the pin. You would think that the bishop's influence on the queen is kind of staggering. And it is, but there's another reason behind this queen e7 move that has to do with his knight on c6. So what do you guys think is the purpose behind queen e7? How does it relate to that knight? What could Rubinstein be up to here? Knight d8 to e6, absolutely. That's what he's up to. Alright, I'm trying to maneuver this board a little bit. Okay. So he's trying to play knight d8 to e6. And the best way for white to meet this is probably with rook e1 and d4. And something like bishop c1. And white's probably slightly better here, just because of the bishop pair. But it's definitely unclear in my opinion. So queen d2 was played in the game. And here comes that knight maneuver. But first, bishop e6. This part's very subtle, so I guess I'll just skip over this and get to the more maneuvery moments. After bishop b3, he played bishop takes b3. I usually don't recommend this kind of thing because it activates the rook. But Rubinstein had a really specific plan for this side of the board, so you'll see. So knight e6, he finished his maneuver. And the pawn on c3 is good. It stops knight d4, but there's nothing stopping knight f4, so it's going to kind of happen at some point. Now, here he played h6. And now a6, which is bolstering this pawn against the rook. You could argue that this is a hook, however. So the pawn on a6, it's not like it's going to be safe long term, but for now it's good. It's interesting to note that he doesn't play a5, because if he plays a5, the rook has to babysit the pawn long term, and he'll have to play b6 anyway to guard it. So that's why it's a6, not a5. So here I think white still should play d4. Let's see. So 66 is saying, why did black trade off his good bishop there? Is it worth it to get rid of the 2 bishops? Good question. So in this position, what do you think the bishop from c8 is going to do? What's its purpose? Does it have a good square? Maybe fianchetto. So if you fianchetto this bishop, you're actually dooming it to a passive existence. If you play, for instance, b6 and bishop b7, you're going to be just staring at this e-pawn. The e-pawn is very well protected. I don't think your bishop's going to do very well. Additionally, if you think about how white wants to maneuver this knight, you can see that the knight wants to go on h4 and then f5. So the knight, it's probably not good to leave it completely uncontested. That being said, in the game, he did trade it for the light square bishop. So it's all very complicated. b6, bishop d5. If they're very insistent, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I didn't think about bishop d5 at all. So I didn't really fully grasp the comment about saying it's a long-term piece. Usually the bishop is stronger long-term. That's true. But there's some concrete things going on right now. In the middle game, it's kind of like... All right, so let's say you have the bishop pair, or you have a good bishop, right? It means that some of the futures are going to lead to you having two bishops in the endgame. You want to preserve it as long as you can. But if no matter what you do, you are going to eventually lose that bishop, you have to face that reality. You can't just keep going with it. Yeah, okay, now I understand what you're saying better. So I said that if your bishop is bad in the middle game, it often doesn't matter because in the end game you're going to find a way out. But I'm not saying that it's a bad bishop. I'm saying that it's a passive bishop. If you put the bishop on b7, it's passive. Passive is not good at basically any moment. So we are going to constantly maneuver to improve our pieces. For example, let me show you this other thing, okay? Not this, this. So fast forwarding a little bit in this position, I want to just show you a situation with a bishop. Okay, I'll just skip this move. And let's pretend we're talking about black's bishop on c8. So I would tell you that this is a bad bishop because all the pawns are on the color of that bishop, right? Basically every pawn from black, and they're fixed. They don't have any way to advance. It's also passive because it's not doing anything. So what should we do with the bishop? Just to speed things along, I think I'll just show you. The bishop wants to come out somewhere. So instead of playing like b6 and a6, which makes some sense, instead of doing that, we could maneuver it around the existing pawn structure without creating any new weaknesses. If we play a move like b6, this pawn is going to be a long-term weakness. c6 is going to be a long-term weakness. It's better not to move it. So it's going to be d7 to e8 to h5. And now the bishop is fine again. It's still a bad bishop, but now it's an active bishop. So I wouldn't really want to put it on a6 because it's not going to be that active there. It's doing something, but after a move like, I guess, b3, I don't think the weaknesses in white's camp are going to be exploitable. I mean, of course, the c-pawn needs to be protected in other ways. Probably it'll be like knight takes e4 followed by b3, something like that. But the bishop will be very passive. It's lacking targets after a move like rook f2. It's just not doing that much there. But here, it's attacking d1, e2, f3, g4. I think these are all critical squares. So coming back to our maneuvering symphony, I don't think that trading this bishop's unreasonable, but I also think this is really deep. Maybe because I'm not such a very strong maneuvering player myself. I find this very conceptually deep. But I think you can rationalize it like this. Rubinstein has a particular kind of endgame that he wants to reach. He had a very simple and long-reaching strategic vision. So even if his particular decisions seem weird in the moment, as long as they get him to the endgame that he wants, he's happy. He's done this again and again. So this is just one more example where he wrecks somebody with a 40-move plan. So it's hard to scrutinize his decision to trade the bishop like this. But it'll make sense when you see the endgame that he gets as a result of his constant trading and maneuvering. It's something you could never predict. It's just something Rubinstein was extremely good at. Now, this move a6 also has a dual purpose. It's sheltering the pawn, but it's also making room for one of black's pieces. What piece do you guys think it is? Just if you had to guess, what piece would go on a7? And I'll give another hint. What is black's worst placed piece? We have to ask ourselves. The queen, exactly. The queen is the worst placed piece. He's maneuvering into a7. So he commenced with this operation very long term. He didn't rush because he also wants to improve the knights. And it's usually common sense to improve the minor pieces before you improve the queen. So he played knight h5. He's going after the f4 square, just making the logical closure of the knight's maneuvers. After d4, they just put the knight on f4. I've also seen Carlsen make almost exactly the same formation in blitz, like not even really thinking too hard about it. He sees a bishop that's stuck like this. He puts one knight to attack the bishop, and he puts the other knight right in its face, so it has no scope. This is a really good way of neutralizing this bishop and just being a general pain to your opponent. Because if they ever play h3, you snap on g3 at that point, and the pawn structure that they get is very difficult to defend. So this is already a major strategic success. The scope and power of this bishop on g3 is essentially nullified by the knights, and the knights still have a lot of their attacking power. Their attacking scores deep in white's territory. Also, the knight on the edge is immune to g4 because the bishop on g3 is blocking the g-pawn. So there's an interference between the g-pawn's abilities and the bishop's. So he just caved and took this knight. I believe in Gelfand's analysis, he talks about queen e3 with the idea of playing rook a d1, rook d2, and rook e d1 for a much more active future. And Gelfand's extremely good in this style of chess as well. I think he probably read a book of Rubinstein's games and in his childhood many times. He was strongly influenced by the guy. So I'd consider him an authority on this style of play as well if you want to look for more model players for this style of play. So after g3, knight g6, this knight looks dominated, right? It doesn't have a bright future anymore because of the g-pawn. And this is true. But because the light square bishop is gone, you know, the one that got traded on b3, there's no way to repair this weakness. They're not going to deal with it long term. So after queen d3, queen e6, it's not that clear what black is doing with the queen. You know, he's kind of probing for weaknesses. I think he wants white to make more pawn moves. And so he also plays f5 to activate his rook. And in response, they play d5, which is basically that same structure that I've showed several times already today. And so after rook takes f5, knight e4, rook a f8, his rooks are at maximum power. Notice how it would have been super weird to play queen c8 to b8 to a7 with a rook on a8. It would mean that he didn't improve his pieces in a basic way before commencing with this very long maneuver with the queen. So he did all the common sense things first. Didn't lose sight of common sense, even though he's been intending to play this queen a7 thing all along. Now, the next thing is that before he does this queen maneuver, he also has to improve another badly placed piece. Which piece do you guys think is worst placed for black right now? Queen's still doing okay. It has the possibility to go to somewhere else. Yeah, so it's the knight. So how should black improve this knight? It's dominated by the g-pawn. It's hanging. What's the best way to utilize it? Where does it belong on the whole board? Okay, so you want to put the knight on f5, but why? Why is it going on f5? I think the pawn on c3 is nicely preventing the knight from reaching its best square from f5, which is d4. and it's pressuring the pawn on g3, but not strongly to the point that I think it is very good. Here's another question. What is white's best placed piece? Do they have any great pieces? Like, why can't we play some active moves on the f-file? What's the matter? No, I mean, what is white's better placed piece? In this example, the rook on f5, it's a little bit impotent because you would like to play rook f2, but the knight's stopping it. So this means the knight on e4 is probably white's best placed piece. So how can we improve our knight and also neutralize their best knight, their best piece? What would that maneuver look like? I guess if you can tell me its final destination, you'll know the path as well. Okay, so the suggestion knight h8 to f7 to g5 has the aim of trading the knights. That makes a lot of sense. The problem is you also get a worse structure in the process. Probably they're going to be able to drive your rook away before they take on g5. So Rubinstein played knight e7, rook d1, king h8, with the idea of knight g8 to f6. No risk, not preventable. Also, if you wanted to put the knight on g5, they could play h4. You could argue that h4 is a weakening move, but it also stops your plan. So this is kind of a surefire way of getting exactly what he wants. So he made all those good trades. And then he went ahead with the maneuver of the queen. So he improves his pieces in a logical order, one by one. Doesn't make any changes in the pawn structure. He's basically following a recipe. He's practically a chef. And now that the queen is on c5, we can see that black is just better. It's a heavy piece endgame, so it's tricky to actually play. But if we just compare them piecewise, these rooks are way better than these two rooks. This pawn on e5, it's never going to be weak. If they play f4 ever to try to loosen up the strong point, they're just going to be opening their own king. So to finish off our segment, I want to just show the rest of the game. So they played queen e4, and the difference in activity of black's queen and white's queen is really distinct, in my opinion. And so he kind of just starts creeping in. This is typical Rubinstein stuff. Slow maneuvering, steadily aiming for that best endgame that you could ever have. And here, even though his queen was better than white's queen, there's no way that he could avoid this exchange, so he does it in a very favorable way. He has doubled pawns, but now the pawn on b4 is much more active than the white pawns. The pawn on b4 freezes the pawns on b3 and c2. So black is virtually up a pawn here. And if they want to liquidate, they're going to end up with a weak b3 pawn long term. So they played c3. That's weak. And now the black rooks switch targets. Musical chairs. He played b6, and the reason for b6 is to prevent white from playing c5, which would activate their rook. This would have been much better. They missed their opportunity. Maybe it's equal. But after b6, the counterplay is just gone. And so he steadily creeped his way in with all the pieces. And here white blundered. With f4, they kind of hastened their demise. So let's see if you guys can guess the winning operation for black. Try to give a couple moves. It's all pretty forcing, I think. Let me just double check. Yeah, it's all forcing stuff. So black to play and get a winning position. H5 has to be the first move? Why? Why should it be? I think these absolute statements are very dangerous to your sanity as a chess player. There are going to be many times when you say, this has to be it. And then it doesn't have to be. I think as a coach, I tend to be more absolute than I should be. Because I try to make things feel more clear and more confident for the people who are trying to solve the puzzle. I don't like to just give the puzzle and be like, okay, you figure it out. You know, I try to encourage people a bit. So if I ever seem a little bit dogmatic, it's because I'm trying to steer you guys in the right direction, get a little confidence boost. But in a real game, it's good to avoid this kind of dogmatic thinking. Rook G1 at some point does look interesting. F4 has a purpose, though. They want to get some open files and take them over with their rooks. Get some counterplay. If they could attack the weak c-pawn, they might just be able to win. So I think if you play very slowly, you might encounter difficulties. So let's look at the more forced lines first. Rook G1 is not that forcing. So I would look at H5, pawn takes F4. These are probably the two main forcing moves. The reason I'm not considering E4 is that they can just play like Rook E3. The reason I'm not considering a move like Rook G5 is it's hanging, and there's no benefit to putting a pawn on G5 for white. If they had a pawn on, like... Alright, so there was a possible mate, so it's sometimes worth considering these crazy things. If white played H4, H5 is mate, right? So whenever the king is kind of trapped, it's good to think about, you know, even the spicier moves, if they could lead to a trapping of the king. But after F4, the king is also able to come back. They want open lines, they also want to bring their king to F3. I'll give the first move. This is creating a weakness long-term on F4. That's usually a good way to start a combination, by saddling your opponent with long-term weaknesses. Now what? Rook F1? What if they play Rook F3 after Rook F1? Your rook's hanging after, like, King G3. So is it worth it to play H5 at this time? If you play H4, I'll play King G4. I'm not sure. Well, maybe this is too subtle. So let me point something out. It's not like complete lights out in one shot, but the idea is that this rook on B3 is busy. So he played H5 first, and then Rook G1, and then Rook G4 to make the rook do some work, right? So we take this. So we win the pawn. This position would still be unclear if it weren't for this operation that he's about to commence with. So King F5 is winning for black, of course, because their king is much better than the white king. But there's still possibility for counterplay. So the way he eliminates all counterplay from this position is with Rook F3, Rook B3. And now the pawn has to advance after some useless checks. Alright, they're not useless. It puts black's king in a more passive position for a short time. But after B5, the queen side is done. It's totally blocked. It's not going to come out again. Yeah, maybe I was optimistic. I thought that since the first few moves were check, that it was very plausible to find Rook G4 and that they can't defend it. Usually when the first few moves are check, I think it's much easier to spot it. But anyway, coming forward again. So he wins the pawn, fixes the weakness, and then he comes back to advance the king side. And this position, you can just take this as a screenshot in your mind of a winning position for black. King's cut off from guarding this critical part of the board by the rook on f6. And this part has a lot of shiesty maneuvering. The check and then coming back steals a tempo because their king can't advance in any way. They tried c5 desperately, which makes some sense. But after d6, black is winning with a tactic. This is an easier tactic. See if you guys can spot it. Black to play. And I don't think tactic is a strong word because they're threatening to take on c7 and get a winning position in two different ways. So we need to do something sharp to prevent that. Yeah, rook d7. I think that this is probably all you need to see. Because after rook takes c7, you're forced to take on d6. Rook d4 is a nice move. Because it's kind of showing that he doesn't care that his king is stuck on the edge. It's controlling the important squares. This maneuvering part is a little bit difficult to explain. It's all tactical stuff. Actually, here's an interesting maneuvering part. So this is a big Yoshilo. No, I'm not playing anyone today. Well, I did all the playing earlier. I played a simul, but now I'm just wrapping up a lesson on maneuvering. So when the rook is checking your king from far away, it can be really annoying when they alternate attacking your king and attacking your king and a pawn. So this zigzag pattern is a good way of neutralizing that. You get closer without ever allowing your pawn to hang. This is a really nice pattern. So after rook c8, rook f3, and the exchange of a couple pawns, they just resigned. Janowski gave up here. Because the two connected pass pawns on the king side is such a big advantage that basically almost anyone can beat an engine here with black, in my opinion. I've tried beating a computer in rook end games where we have just one pass pawn, and it's technically much, much more difficult. But in this situation, the connected pawns are really, really big. And the king's not even in front. So it makes sense that Janowski resigned against the great Rubinstein here. So this was kind of a maneuvering symphony, this last game. It showed a lot of the concepts that I thought we could derive from base principles, like how the pieces interact with the board, interact with each other, how the slower moving pawns, you can kind of consider them as like a long-term field of control and then maneuver around it accordingly. In this game, I think Rubinstein really nicely shows how we can bring all these together into a masterpiece game.